I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week we'll highlight the Sprint for City Hall, a new series by the New York Times tracking the campaign for next month's Democratic mayoral primary. The series debuted this week. But first, I'd like to welcome two Times correspondents to discuss President Trump's recent moves targeting Black history and the arts. Clyde McGrady joins us. His revealing Times investigation explored how museums and cultural institutions are challenging the administration's executive orders. Also with us, Times culture correspondent Pogrebin, whose reporting has documented the ripple effects across arts organizations nationwide as NEA grants suddenly vanish following presidential pressure. Welcome to both of you. Clyde, the White House, the Trump administration, does not want institutions that are funded by the federal government to disseminate improper ideology. What is improper ideology?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a slippery term. The executive director of the Whitney plantation in Louisiana described it as, Orwellian. But the administration sees it as, any sort of attempt to quote unquote rewrite the nation's history to paint, America as this bad actor who's done bad things, particularly when it comes to our racial history, particularly slavery. They named the National Museum of African American History and Culture specifically in their March 27th executive order, sort of trying to, I guess, clamp down on what these museums and cultural institutions can highlight. They would like a much smoother, sort of sentimental, I guess, view of American history and race.
Don't they remember that the founders wanted to create a more perfect union, that it wasn't perfect at all, even when they established it? So who defines what's proper?
Yeah, well, that's kind of been a thread throughout American history. One of the things that I mentioned in the story that a historian brought up was the lost cause, which, of course, was this narrative that emerged after the Civil War about why the Civil War was really fought. The lost cause stated that slavery was, not that important to why the Civil War was fought, and it sort of downplayed the South's race issue, which of course led to, you know, uh, racial violence and Jim Crow, which would only be broken up in the 1950s and 60s with the Civil Rights Act. So these narratives about the country have meaning for the present, and it's how people, continually fight over the meaning of certain events or certain principles that this country holds.
Of course, it's not just the South. A lot of people forget the pivotal role that New York played in slavery as well. Robin,
Mhm.
what's the impact of this on museums and other cultural institutions? Are they resisting, capitulating, trying to find some middle ground?
I think as across the board with, that is, a response shared by universities and by people in the corporate sphere, law firms, for example, you're seeing a similar kind of cowed posture on the part of cultural institutions right now. Certainly a lot of fear if they're not sort of outright capitulating quite yet, but certainly not a sort of level of resistance that perhaps we saw in the last Trump term. I think there's just a lot of concern about losing funding that is essential to their operations and they really depend on and survive on, particularly in terms of the National Endowment for the Arts, which doesn't give a huge amount of money, but it can be quite meaningful. And it's had a real chilling effect.
How dependent are most of these institutions on federal money?
Well, the federal money is not immense, as I said, in terms of a proportion of their budget. But why it's important is it's an imprimatur from the federal government. It's sort of sanctioning and approving that kind of work. And they're able to leverage those funds into getting private donations, which is really essential for these institutions.
Clyde, you reported in the Times that some people in the administration are having misgivings, which has led to some reversals in this policy, or at least a leavening of the policy. Why is that? Where's the pressure coming from? Is it from local congressmen, civic leaders? Who's saying, whoa, not so fast?
Well, so the example that I cite is the again the Whitney plantation, which has some federal funding, and they received two federal grants. They got reversed. Now I talked to the executive director, and she wasn't exactly sure why they were reversed. She sort of alluded to maybe the administration having some lawsuit exposure because those grants were, already promised to them, and so they were already almost spent. So maybe the administration was afraid of, being open to a lawsuit, but they capitulated and just gave them the money anyway. But she isn't sure exactly why that happened.
Robin, is anyone standing up and saying, it's not up to the government to decide what's proper or not in terms of history? We've always fought about our history. As Faulkner said, it's not dead, it's not even past. Who is saying the federal government can't do this?
Well, one really good example that I wrote about recently is the Detroit Opera is mounting an opera called the Central Park Five, which is about the five youths, Black and Hispanic, who were accused of raping the Central Park jogger in 1989. And it features Trump as a character in it because Trump made himself central to the story at the time by taking out a full-page ad in the Times and other papers calling for the death penalty.
Right.
And so this opera knew it was kind of stepping into the crosshairs with its production, which actually opens next week. And they decided to just risk it and move ahead, feeling that it's more important to put that kind of art out there into the world and let the consequences come what may. We'll see what happens. They do get an NEA grant for the production. They received $40,000. But it's of a $1 million budget, and it's already been appropriated. We'll see if it even comes to Trump's attention. But that's one example where they knew very well what they were doing, and the board got behind it anyway, even though it might be a risk to that company.
What about major institutions that maybe like Harvard have the resources to fight something like this? Where's Lincoln Center? Where's the Museum of Natural History? Just to name a couple in New York.
Yeah, well, I think that nobody necessarily wants to be first and sticking their necks out on this. There's a real kind of culture of keep your head down right now. But I think if this funding really starts to go away in a meaningful way across the board, you may see some kind of coalescing by these institutions around this and speaking out with more of a unified voice. It would take something, I think, like the Met Museum, one of the biggies that could survive a real loss and kind of having them sort of, just come out ahead of these issues, but the smaller ones kind of really can't afford it. Everybody's really very much worried about being able to fund their operations for the next few years going forward.
And even when you talk about a $40,000 grant to many institutions, that's a large percentage of their budget. Clyde, you wrote a wonderful line in the story that you can't bottle history again. You can't put it back in the bottle. Is that what people are trying to do?
Um, that's what, some of the people I went to these museums to just talk with the visitors about how they felt about it. And that is, how they characterize what was happening. I do think it is important to focus on these institutions because, of course, they are these big knowledge producing or knowledge archiving places where people go to learn. But one of the things that I did want to do with my story was just talk to the people who patronize these places and see how they were thinking about it. And there is a self-determination among the people, especially, from the post George Floyd era with this sort of intense focus on American history and how we got to that moment. And there is a determination among many people, particularly, African American people, to say, hey, this isn't right, for them to push back on this and for them to also, be more proactive about learning about American history. And, uh, I talked about like post Roots in the 70s after that miniseries came out. There was this sort of movement of Black people to demand museums and archives display certain information that had been overlooked in the past. So there is this sort of, you know, democratic, maybe populist element to all this as well. But as Robin, rightfully pointed out, what these institutions are able to do going forward matters greatly.
Robert, you wrote in the Times that the National Museum of Black History, African American History, and Culture is facing a special challenge. What is that?
Well, that particular museum sort of sums up or embodies all of these things that the Trump administration is objecting to. One of them is even characterizing race as a construct rather than just something that is intrinsic. That's something they take issue with. And it also, even while it celebrates Black achievement and progress, it also really critiques the United States for its role in kind of a history of oppression. And here you have a Trump administration that, as Clyde said, really wants to put forward a different version of American history, one that is more celebratory, more patriotic, and more positive. And they're really objecting to, the very essence of what that museum is all about.
It certainly is. Have they made any changes as a result of this?
They say they haven't so far, but it does seem like they might be willing to kind of pull back on some wall text or things that might be sort of directly more provocative to the Trump administration, things that wouldn't compromise its integrity and its mission. It's going to be interesting to see whether they're able to do that, and also how that director, Lonnie Bunch, he was the founding director, but he's the head of the whole Smithsonian, how he can walk that line between accommodating the Trump administration without really compromising their principles.
And especially since, as we say, history is sort of fungible. It depends who's telling it, usually the winners. Clyde, we talked about on this program an instructor at Columbia Journalism School who warned foreign students not to write op-ed pieces that might be controversial. Are you finding that historians, authors, playwrights are having the same kind of fear?
I mean, the historians that I've talked to, I haven't really had a problem getting them to go on the record and talk about, in a critical way what the administration is doing. So I'm not sure exactly how much the academics are worried. Now, maybe it also depends on what type of institution of higher learning they're from, private versus public. Of course, that matters greatly in terms of their funding. But I've not, encountered it. Although I've heard that there are, some presidents who are very worried about being critical of the president because, as we talked about, that funding is so critical to their mission.
Diversity, equity, inclusion has become a toxic term these days. Robin, how is the cultural world reacting to that? Are they simply saying we're going to abolish all our programs, or what?
It's interesting. They're pretty much abolishing all their programs. I mean, there was such an incredible turn after George Floyd where these institutions, it was really sort of this kind of come to Jesus moment where they all realized they were now accountable, that a lot of them hired special DEI executives to oversee these efforts and even set real goals for themselves in terms of creating more equity among the staff and in terms of what they show and present. And in terms of their boards and their governance. All of that seems to be now in reverse. It's a real swing back, which is certainly unfortunate. And to Clyde's point, I mean, even some of those who would seem to be a little more immune to the pressure, someone like David Rubenstein, who headed the the Kennedy Center, and he was ousted as chairman by Trump, who then appointed himself as chairman. Even he has stayed silent. I think there's a sense of not wanting to poke the bear on this, and that's really, a pronounced difference from the past.
Did some of these people say, look, we did go too far, that some of these things did get out of hand, and if we move a little more to the center, that's not such a bad thing?
I think there is a feeling that there's somewhat of an appropriate correction to some degree in terms of the wokeness that some people felt was too extreme, a cancel culture that a lot of people felt was silencing, and there was a sort of an imbalance the other way. But on the other hand, these are years of trying to correct a real history of exclusion. And so there is a real feeling that this is sort of regressive, I think, on the part of our country.
Thanks to Clyde McGrady, Robin Pogrebin of the New York Times for that update. And coming up next, keeping up with the Democratic primary and its almost dozen candidates. We're joined now by Dean Chang, Deputy Metro Editor for Politics at the New York Times. He leads the team behind the Sprint for City Hall, a special series covering New York's Democratic mayoral primary. It's June 24th, just 7 weeks away. Dean's team provides weekly updates every Tuesday with news, insights, campaign developments that might otherwise go unnoticed as we approach this consequential election. I can say I thoroughly read this past week's episode, and I thought it was very thorough and very well done, Dean. Are we in a sprint to the mayoral primary, or is it more like a crawl as far as the public is concerned?
It's been a crawl, but I think now you're starting to see ads on television. We'll have the 2 Democratic debates coming up next month. So if there is a sprint, I believe it starts now, which is why we wanted to start the newsletter now, to sort of get our readers up to speed on who the candidates are, the issues, and just why this race is particularly so critical and unusual.
Very unusual. In fact, it's so hard to make a prediction. The only prediction you made is that Eric Adams is not going to win the Democratic nomination.
That's right. He's still a Democrat, but he's not going to be on the ballot. He's running as an independent in November. And most times when there's a Democrat incumbent, the election is sort of a dull affair, right? There's no real challenger. Everyone assumes that the incumbent is going to win a second term. But this is not an ordinary year, right? Eric Adams isn't even on the ballot. He has a variety of self-inflicted wounds. Who knows how we'll do in November? And so this is almost like an open seat in a way.
Dean, you pointed out that ballot order, which is chosen randomly, really doesn't matter that much. It would seem if you go into a voting booth, you're more inclined to vote to someone at the top of the line.
I would have assumed that, but last time around 4 years ago, somebody named Aaron Foldenauer was number 1, and he didn't do so well, and Eric Adams was number 9, and he won the primary. I think if you didn't know anything about any candidate and you saw a ballot with 11 names or 13 names, perhaps it might be weighted to the top one. But I think most people who vote have a general idea who they want, and they can scroll down and find the person they do want.
I think you're right. The voting is so small as a percentage of votes eligible that you'd like to assume that those who are actually going to vote know what they're thinking. What about ranked choice? That throws a whole other variable into the primary, into making predictions. I don't think all our listeners understand ranked choice, which is understandable. Can you try to explain it?
How long do you have? No, it's actually not that complicated, and I think we may focus next week's newsletter a little bit on ranked choice. But so last time around, 2021 was the first time New Yorkers had a chance to use ranked choice in a mayoral primary. And you get to choose 5 candidates in sequential order. Like, I want this guy first or this woman first. If that person doesn't win, then I want this person second or this person third. But 13% of people who cast their ballots last time around only listed one person. And of those 13%, half of them voted for Eric Adams. So there's a very fair chance that if you did so, if you voted just for one person, that your vote would have been considered exhausted or not counted in the final analysis. Mm-hmm. If you don't end up ranking one of the final 2 candidates that make it to the final round, your vote basically doesn't count.
And someone has to get 50%, ultimately.
Right. So in the very first round of tabulations, if some candidate gets 50%, that's it. It's over. There's no ranked choice doesn't even come to play. So that didn't happen last time around. Maybe it happens this time around with Andrew Cuomo or someone else. If that were to happen, then ranked choice would not come into play. If no one reaches that threshold, then you wait a week. Absentee ballots come in, and then they begin the ranked choice process.
Dean, we have something like a dozen candidates who qualified for the ballot. What's going to be the defining issue or event or whatever in picking a mayor? I know this is very hypothetical. I mean, is it money? Is it TV? Is it endorsements? What's going to count?
I don't think it's endorsements, right? There may have been a time when endorsements mattered more in elections in New York City, and I just don't think any endorsement really carries voters to that degree. Sure, they help in terms of organizing and phone banks and such if it's a big union. I think it more has to do, each election is often a reaction to the previous office holder, and I think New Yorkers may be looking for someone who may demonstrate more managerial ability than perhaps Eric Adams has shown in the last 3.5 years. So if that's the defining quality that New Yorkers are looking for, they may look for Andrew Cuomo since he was governor, or someone else who has held office before. If it's crime, if people feel that they're not safe on the subways, again, they may look for someone who is more traditional about law and order and having more police on the streets.
I think you're absolutely right about looking at the past, even though it may or may not repeat itself, that if you look sequentially back to, I would go back to Jimmy Walker, in fact, you could see each new mayor was pretty much a reaction to the previous mayor. And I guess we're going to somehow do that again. What about money? Who has most of it? Where is it coming from?
At the moment, some of the candidates who've been in the race longer still have more money than Andrew Cuomo. But Cuomo just entered the race fairly recently, and he's raised almost like $1 million a week from donors. And that doesn't even include the super PAC that's not technically coordinated with Andrew Cuomo, but also is spending a lot of money on his behalf.
Super PAC can do what? Anything?
Yeah, they cannot be officially coordinating with the campaign, but they can spend as much money as they want with no limits, and they can take as much donations as they want with no limits. There are very strict limits in terms of contributing directly to a campaign, but you can contribute $500,000 to a super PAC, and that super PAC can buy as many ads it wants to on behalf of a candidate.
Even with his legal fees, presumably he's got a lot of money left over from his gubernatorial campaigns. Can he use any of that?
Well, in terms of the legal fees, actually the state is picking up, taxpayers are picking up his legal fees, and there's some estimate that it may be as high as $60 million.
6-0?
6-0. And that's not just to combat the allegations of sexual harassment. It's also to defend his legal bills for the accusations that he may have in some way covered up his role in nursing home deaths during COVID.
What about the issues? Are the candidates really far apart? What is the range among the 11 or so candidates?
Most of the major Democrats are pretty much in agreement on the major issues. Probably the vast majority would probably characterize themselves as progressives, and Eric Adams is more of a moderate. He's not even in this race. Adrian Adams is more of a moderate. Andrew Cuomo is more of a moderate. But, you know, Zoran Mamdani, who's now second in polls and is probably the most progressive of all the candidates, he's out there saying, you know, I want buses to be free. I want to establish supermarkets, groceries that would be free for lower income New Yorkers. He's probably like the archetypical progressive candidate who has ideas that you probably have not seen in New York like played out, like making buses free, for example.
A relative unknown, I think we can say fairly, from Queens. Why is he doing in the polls as well as he is?
I don't know if you've seen any of his social media, but he is quite talented in terms of getting his message across. It's almost like a short SNL skit, the way he was able to convey what he wants to convey with using a camera and running out to the streets and talking to people, using real language. It doesn't feel rehearsed. It doesn't feel stiff. It feels like he feels relatable.
You talked about how much money the candidates are accumulating. Where is it coming from? Who's contributing?
Well, I think you're seeing, with Mamdani, he has by far the highest number of individual donors, small money donors, not people who have maxed out. And as a result, you've also seen a very effective on-the-ground volunteer campaign network for him getting his name out there.
On the issue this past Tuesday, we asked Fran Lebowitz to rate the candidates. Are we going to ask other people too as the weeks go on?
Yeah, certainly. We've asked quite a few people. I was actually surprised that we have not gotten quite as many responses. I guess in New York, you don't want to necessarily say I'm for this person, and then another person says, well, how can you say you're not for me? Like, I thought we were friends. So we're getting a lot of that, a lot of kind of, I'm going to pass for now. But we're going to bring one every week.
You talked about a couple of progressive candidates. Is it possible or likely they're going to split the progressive vote, and a centrist, or there is no conservative, I guess, a centrist is going to slip in?
Yeah, I mean, that's how to sort of game out ranked choice voting is something that the candidates will have to grapple with. They didn't do a very good job of it in 2021. I think the campaigns are more committed, and things like people like the Working Families Party are more committed to trying to find a way to cross-endorse. I mean, like the Working Families Party, for example, endorsed 4 candidates, not just one, because they want to stress that, hey, even if our one person doesn't win, put these other people on the ballot so at least one of these people wins.
And it looks like it's going to be a free-for-all in November, no matter what happens.
Yeah, I think we're guaranteed to have at least 5 candidates on the ballot. You've got the Democratic candidate, whoever that may be, the Republican candidate. You've got an independent in Jim Walden. The Working Families Party may put someone up, and Eric Adams, of course.
And interesting names for the independent parties, too. People are being very creative.
Yeah. Stop Anti-Semitism is one of Eric Adams. I think Safe and Affordable is another. If you're going to run as an independent, you can run in one of the established parties, like Libertarian, or you can create your own, and that's the route that Eric
Is there any Conservative Party candidate?
Not that I know of. It may well be that Curtis Sliwa gets that line. He has the Republican line. He's running unopposed. I'd have to actually check to see if he has the conservative line. It doesn't generate a lot of votes in New York City.
A quick last question. The tracker that we're running on the site, how do we figure that?
The candidate tracker?
Yeah.
How do you, I'm sorry.
I mean, how is it based on polls or?
Well, the candidate tracker that we have is just simply listing the 11 Democrats who made the ballot. I think there were as many as 13 that we thought they were going to be in the race,
Right.
but 2 didn't qualify, didn't get enough signatures. One who did qualify, Dr. Selma Bartholomew, was kind of a surprise to us. We didn't expect her to make the race, but she is. I don't know if she'll make the first or either of the 2 debates. I think there's some kind of criteria. In which,
Yeah.
But yeah,
There
the
is
tracker.
a floor on the poll.
Right. But the tracker is just simply, here's who's in the race. And we also have an issues tracker as well, how some of the major candidates, where they stand on the various issues.
Dean Chang, Deputy Metro Editor of the New York Times for Politics, thanks for joining us. That's it for this edition of Close Up for the New York Times and CUNY TV. I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.